Hello, my name is Madeline, and today I'll be talking about autumn leaves. I'll be analyzing Alyssa Morris's fifth movement of her Collision Etudes written in 2017. These etudes are inspired by 6 paintings by female American painters. According to her website, Morris was inspired by Silvestrini's wonderful etude collection 6 Etudes pour au bois, and Silvestrini based his etudes on 6 French Impressionist paintings. This presentation will focus on how different media influenced and inspired Morris's fifth movement, Autumn Leaves. The media I analyzed include Georgia O'Keeffe's painting Autumn Leaves and Joseph Kuzma's piece Autumn Leaves. Kuzma's piece is now considered a standard jazz piece, and famous musicians such as Miles Davis, Cannonball Adderley, Chet Baker, and John Coltrane have performed unique versions of this piece. The harmonic, melodic, and rhythmic structures of Morris's movement contain elements of O'Keeffe's painting and the jazz standard Autumn Leaves. Morris was inspired by the solos of Miles Davis, Cannonball Adderley, Chet Baker, and John Coltrane when each of these musicians performed the jazz piece, and I think there are elements of these solos embedded in Morris's movement. There are distinct narratives present in the painting, jazz standard, and oboe etude that are all related to each other. To begin, let's take a look at Morris's fifth movement, Autumn Leaves. In her program notes, Morris states that she uses elements from performances of this piece to construct the melodies and implied harmonies. I use Almain's article on musical narrative to structure my analysis. I wanted to look at how Morris used specific musical elements from the other media previously mentioned, so I assigned narratives to these elements. To me, the movement tells a story of autumn leaves changing colors and falling, and this is achieved through the characters in this musical story. I looked at the rhythms that were swung versus rhythms that are played evenly. I also looked closely at musical techniques in the movement that were inspired by other media and those that are unique to Morris's writing and the oboe. This is Georgia O'Keeffe's painting Autumn Leaves, Lake George, painted in 1924. O'Keeffe was focused on abstract representations of light, shape, and color and paid close attention to details. To me, her art is abstract in that the leaves are not normally this large or colored like this, and I think Morris included musical depictions of this artwork in her piece. While O'Keeffe is abstract in her use of setting or the size and colors of the leaves, Morris is abstract in her use of timbre. She includes techniques like tremolos in this movement, something that isn't very common for the oboe to perform. While O'Keeffe is bold in her use of colors, Morris is bold in her use of dynamics, style, tempo, and range. In this movement, Morris uses a wide range of dynamics and uses both the high and low registers of the oboe. Additionally, the oboe is almost never called upon to perform jazz, but this entire movement is based on jazz. Morris also wrote 4 distinct sections with different tempos and transitions in between. Finally, I believe that sections are not only inspired by jazz artists, but are inspired by O'Keeffe's painting. For example, the last 2 lines of this movement, pictured here, almost feel like leaves moving in the wind because of the notes and rhythms that Morris uses. In addition to O'Keeffe's painting, Morris also mentions the original song Autumn Leaves, written by Joseph Kosma in 1945. I listened to Roger Williams' performance of this piece and have transcribed the melody. This melody is played evenly without any swung rhythms. Morris begins the second section of Autumn Leaves with straight quarter notes, similar to how Kosma began his own melody. I believe Morris was inspired by Kosma's use of even rhythms, as she includes these kinds of motifs in her movement. Morris's Autumn Leaves has a combination of swung and even rhythms, which is why I believe these are central to the musical narrative of the piece. Kosma's Autumn Leaves is now a jazz standard pictured here. When we compare Morris's piece with the jazz standard, we see that they have different structures. However, Morris stated that the etude follows the chord progression of the jazz standard played twice through in her program notes. More than this, Morris is directly and indirectly influenced by jazz musicians' performances of the standard Autumn Leaves. Cannonball Adderley and Miles Davis performed this tune on the 1958 album Something Else. Both musicians play on the same track, but their solos sound very different. Not only do they use different instruments and therefore have different timbres, but they also play with various rhythms. Davis's solo feels like it's played at a slower tempo, which Morris portrays in her own piece by having the solo oboe play licks at a slower tempo. The contrast between Adderley's and Davis's solos is portrayed in Morris's piece and contributes to her own narratives. Here we see how Morris is directly influenced by Davis's trumpet solo. On the left we see Morris's piece, and on the right is my transcription of part of Davis's solo. Morris included this lick in her own etude, and these rhythms are swung. Here we see another example of a lick Morris included in her own version of Autumn Leaves. While these 2 licks aren't identical, to me it shows how Morris was inspired by Davis. This is the final example of similarities between Davis's solo and Morris's piece. There are also similarities in how Davis and Morris use grace notes and eighth notes. All of Davis's licks that Morris used are included in the first section of her movement, the lento rubato section. As mentioned before, Davis's solo feels like it's played at a slower tempo, especially when compared to Adderley or Coltrane's solos. So, it makes sense that Morris wrote his licks in this tempo. To me, it helps to distinguish between the different jazz artists' solos. Morris's next section of her piece is the swing eighth note section, and this includes elements from Cannonball Adderley's solo. These two photos are from Morris's piece, and all three of these measures are rather difficult to perform on oboe. I think Morris composed this to imitate the sound of Adderley that he made with his saxophone in his own performance. Chet Baker's solo is full of swung eighth note rhythms, which Morris includes in the beginning of her swing eighth note section. And John Coltrane's solo is full of saxophone timbre. He creates sounds on the saxophone that would be really tricky to replicate on other instruments. I believe this is why Morris adds these tremolos in measures 50, 52, and 54. These tremolos add a sort of wild timbre that sounds really, really good on oboe. Morris doesn't try to copy Coltrane, but rather writes to recreate his sounds well on the oboe. To conclude, let's take a look at the narrative archetypes I believe are included in Morris's movement. I called swung rhythms motive A and even rhythms motive B. Both swung and even rhythms are played consistently throughout the movement. We begin with the lento rubato section that starts on even quarter notes, immediately interrupted by triplets. In this section, swung rhythms are written out as triplets. In the swing eighth note section, we swing eighth notes and 16th notes, but ultimately end this section playing straight eighths at measure 59. In the adagio and allegro sections, notes are played in groups of 5, 6s, and 3s. So this movement ends on a triplet figure. For this reason, I believe transgression succeeds over order, so this piece is a comedy with emphasis on triumph. I also analyzed if this movement is mostly inspired by other works or if it's more unique to the oboe and Morris. While this work is clearly influenced by jazz performers, Morris does a fantastic job of making sure that the movement works well on the oboe. More than this, Morris begins the movement with elements that are clearly inspired by Miles Davis and Cannonball Adderley. However, by the middle of the movement, Morris has moved away from including licks from other artists and begins to incorporate licks of her own. She is also able to, by the second half of the movement, be in a jazzy style for the oboe, something that's pretty unconventional. By the end of the movement, Morris is simply having the performer play in the style of jazz on the oboe. These two riffs are examples of very jazzy rhythms that aren't imitations of other famous soloists. I don't hear rhythms like these in any of the performances previously mentioned, and I believe that these are unique to Morris's writing. These riffs occur in the second half of the piece at measures 57 and 61 respectively. I think this shows how Morris begins the movement imitating others, but begins to develop her own voice by the end. To conclude, Morris's fifth movement, Autumn Leaves, does include licks from other solos and licks of her own. It definitely has influences from O'Keeffe's painting based on artistic choices that both artists made, and all of these media do impact Morris's narratives. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and please let me know if you have any questions.